Hey everyone, Kevin here with JcrOffroad. Today in the garage we're going to be working on installing a set of our Evap and floor skids along with our Crusader rock sliders on this 2023 Ford Maverick. So in this video we're going to be talking about installing the Evap and floor skids as well as the sliders out on the sides. Due to that, there's going to be a little bit of overlap in the two parts, but we'll try and cover that in as best of detail as we can. And there will be a little bit of shared hardware, if you will, so if you're installing both products at the same time like we are here, you're going to wind up with a little extra, so don't be too concerned about that. Before these floor and Evap skids can go on, you first need to get rid of the factory underbody protection, if you can call it that. For that, we're going to start out with a T30 Torx socket. Using that T30, we'll first remove the 3 screws along the front edge here. Then coming over here, this is the outside front corner. You're going to have this plastic clip holding this liner up into the floor. You'll just need a flat screwdriver to get under the edge of this and pop the center free. You can then pull the entire clip, kind of freeing up that section. There are 2 more of these along this outside edge at the rear of this liner. Now the only other hardware you'll encounter when removing these are the nuts you can kind of see here, as well as up in some of these recessed holes. There's kind of a series of those all the way along the length of the skid, and you're going to need a 10mm socket to get those removed. Now hang on to these as you're getting them removed, because you'll want to put some of them back on to retain some of the heat shields up under here after our skid's installed. Now the only real difference between the driver and passenger side liner are the 2 screws you see here, since this driver side liner is a little bit longer and consists of 2 pieces. So you can remove these if you want to take it apart and remove it in 2 separate pieces, or if you leave these together, it'll just be kind of a longer, slightly more cumbersome piece to remove. Just like at the front, you'll need a T30 Torx in this location. With the hardware removed, these are basically just going to fall off. You may find that some of the holes are kind of hung up on the coarse thread studs that protrude down from the body, so you may just have to kind of wiggle that or pull on it a little bit, and it should pretty easily slide free from the vehicle. With that out of the way, you'll use the same tools to get this rear section removed. Once you have this down and out of the way, you can repeat that process to remove the passenger side liner. Next, you can come up here and remove the Evap canister skid plate. This is a metal skid now, and it's held in place with 4 fasteners. It's a bolt on this front corner and nuts on the other 3, and you'll use your 10mm socket for these as well. With those 4 fasteners removed, you do have a couple clips on the back 2 mounting studs that you may have to kind of work at for a minute to get this down. You should be able to kind of pull down on those, kind of back and forth, and free that up. You can then come back up here and just spin the clip off, or snip it with a pair of cutters and pop it off that way as well. Basically what you're doing here is loosening this bracket so that our skid can slide in place above it, and then we'll secure everything back in this location. So again, go ahead and remove this one. And then loosen this one in here. Then you'll grab a 21mm socket and loosen the forwardmost bolt up here. We can then just let that hang, and that should give us all the room we need above this bracket. Now, just for safety purposes, I will point out again that this forwardmost bolt on the bracket here is the rear subframe mounting bolt. So you want to make sure that you only have one of these loose at a time, because obviously that subframe is a big assembly, it's heavy, it's holding your engine, transmission, and everything up there. So work one side at a time when getting these installed. Then right here, kind of just inside of our Evap canister, you'll be installing your first nut tab. You're going through the larger hole up here in the front and aligning the threaded kind of pre-installed nut with the smaller hole here at the rear. This is the tab you're installing in that location. It's the only one that's going to have these two bends kind of stepped in it. While you can kind of manipulate this into position here, the heat shield that you see right here kind of gets in the way, especially once it's pinched into place by our skid, and can kind of knock this out of alignment. So what we did here, and you can kind of see it, we cut a slit in there. We did that using a pair of sheet metal shears or tin snips like you see here, basically just one blade width in, a little bit over an inch. That allows us to take this and just kind of bend it back over itself and get it completely out of the way of this whole location. So then you'll take your nut tab and place it in there aligned with that hole. As you follow this kind of raised channel in the floor back closer to the rear of the vehicle, you're going to be looking for this hole here and this larger slightly oval hole here. This is where we're going to install 2 more nut tabs. Those ones are going to look like this. They're just a flat tab with a pre-installed nut on the back side. So you'll slide that into the back edge of this channel. The easiest way we found to get the front one in is just to take a small stick magnet like I have here. You'll kind of hook it to one end of the tab and push that all the way forward to the hole up here. You can then use either a bolt or just a screwdriver to kind of hold in the nut location on there, and then pull your magnet back away. And then using your screwdriver, you can kind of line that up and center it up in the hole. With the next nut tab, you should just be able to reach in through here, sliding it forward and lining it up in the center of that slotted hole. Now, since we're right here, I'm going to point out why we held on to those little factory nuts that were holding those factory liners in place earlier on. That is for basically this row of studs right here closest to the exhaust. We're going to reinstall those now to hold these heat shields in place. This could be done after our skid's in place as well, just to any of the exposed stud locations. Either or, it's entirely up to you, and then go ahead and install the 2 back on the gas tank heat shield as well. With that secure, we're now going to grab our driver's side skid and start lifting it into position. Now, since we're doing this up on a 2-post lift, we are going to have to kind of contend with our hoist arms out on the side here. I'm going to have to use a couple jacks really to support part of the vehicle while I get those out of the way. If you're doing this on a drive-on kind of 4-post lift setting, that might be a little bit easier. Or if you're doing it down on the ground with some jack stands in your garage or your driveway, you just need to kind of carefully pay attention to where you're putting those jack stands, because out here along the factory pinch seam is not going to be the best place. That's going to kind of interfere with the skids and the slider in this scenario. So then once we get our hoist arms out of the way and we've got everything figured out there, we're going to be using our transmission jack in this case up at this height to kind of support our skid while we put it into place. If you're doing this again on the ground, you can use a floor jack or even a pair of them in this case to kind of lift up the entire skid into position. Now, the easiest place to start is at the front of the skid up here, and making sure you get the front mounting flange of the skid over this front subframe bracket, and then lining up the one slotted hole there. You can reinstall the factory bolt, and then we'll begin working our way back and installing more of the skid mounting hardware. Now, as we lift this into position, you first want to make sure that the outside mounting flange out here is just inside of the factory pinch weld or pinch seam out here, and then we'll have a few things to line up on the inside mounting flange of our skid along the way. The main things to look for in here, we provide cutouts for these two, which is the fuel line in this location and the electrical wiring back here. And then you just have the studs that protrude from the body along this rail or flange section that you have to line up with all the slotted holes in our skid as you lift this up. So this you might have to kind of help out initially there, and then it should fall into place. After you're confident that your skid is aligned properly, but it's still kind of hanging loose just below the body, you'll find this mounting or support bracket really. This is going to go in place behind this flange on your skid, so you have to kind of flip it and slide it over the top here, making sure that it lines up with and clears the 2 studs here, and then clears these lines as well. You'll then find the 3/8 button head hardware in your bolt pack. You'll slide those in from the outside as far as the bolts, and then For the inside, you're going to have a 3/8 flange locking nut that you'll reach behind here and thread into place. So go ahead and do that for all 3 of these. Now what this bracket is essentially a preload bracket. So you're going to want this incredibly tight to the floor to prevent any rattling. It's basically there to take any impact from underneath. So in this location, once you have all 3 of these started, you're just going to push this all the way up in its slots. Kind of make sure it's even front to rear. And then with a 7/32 hex, you can tighten all 3 of these up. And now when you press this the rest of the way up tight to the floor, you'll have a little bit of a gap in your front mounting flange along this side. That's intentional. You want that preload that you're going to get from tightening the hardware there against this bracket. Now what you do next really depends on whether or not you're installing just the skid or the skid and the slider like we are here. So if you're just doing the skid at this time, you'll want to press this outside edge all the way up tight in here and then press out toward the outside of the vehicle, basically making sure the skid is tight to the inside of the pinch seam out there, which we'll look at in just a minute. Once you've done that, you can come back through and tighten all 3 of these up, securing the inside of the skid. Now like we're doing, where we're installing the slider and the skids in conjunction with one another, we're going to leave this a little loose at this time because the slider needs to slide in between the mounting flange of our skid and that factory pinch seam. So we're going to slide this in for now to give ourselves as much space as possible, and then we'll start lifting our slider into place. So coming out here, this is kind of that outside mounting flange on the skid, as well as the pinch seam or weld seam that we've been referencing here. This is where you're going to have to do some drilling. Basically, you can use the Evap skid and the slider if you're installing those as a guide for where to drill your holes, but we're going to kind of go over it as well. So starting with the front hole on the Evap skid right here, you're basically going to line that up with the cutouts that you can see here on the factory plastic trim. You can see that there's a small section of plastic kind of in your way from being able to drill a hole in these locations. So take some sort of cutters in those locations, and you're basically just going to snip that plastic right out of the way. The easiest thing to do is kind of just line it up with each edge of the cutout, and you'll kind of remove this tab. If you are installing the slider as well, which we're going to be, you'll come back up to this front one and do the same thing here. Then for this one, do the same thing if you haven't already, and then the next 3 coming back, you'll do the same thing there, and then we'll kind of jump to the back of the skid and show you what's going on back there. So here at the back of the skid, the rearmost hole, again, just corresponding with the Evap skid in this location, you'll do the same thing, just cut out that same rectangle. However, this one, you have kind of a large section of this factory pinch seam that protrudes off of here, where you're not going to be able to get a nut on the back side. So we don't put a hole there. We kind of just have cutouts to clearance for those kind of protrusions. Your hole in this location is going to be right up here in line with this forwardmost kind of rectangle cutout. The hole is going to be right in the center of it. So here you just kind of have to mark out and cut your own rectangle. It's really kind of up to you how you do it in this location, but to keep it the most discreet, you kind of just go to the center of this with your hole and make about a 3/4 to 1 inch wide rectangle. If you wanted to, you could come from the edge of this opening here and kind of make a larger rectangle in this whole location if that's kind of easier or what you prefer. Just as a reference, in this location, measuring off the front edge of that factory cutout, you're about 2 1/4 to the center and what will line up with your mounting hole here. So for this one, I'm just using my tin snips or sheet metal shears, if you will, to make the vertical cuts. And then I'll grab a razor knife to cut horizontally here and pull this piece out of the way. Now working at the very rear of this factory trim section, just behind the Evap skid, you are going to skip this one entirely. There is no mounting provision here, so don't cut that out. And then coming to this rear cutout, that again has kind of a protruding section on the back side, so we couldn't go in the center of it here. you actually come just forward of it. Again, you can use your slider as a guide, but basically you'll measure from the front edge of that cutout about 3/4 of an inch forward. That should be pretty much the center of your hole location here. So again, you want to give yourself a little bit of room with a cutout. Basically what I'm going to do is make this rectangle opening larger, and I'll give myself about a 1/2 inch in front of what should be the center of our hole that we're drilling here. So with that rectangle cut out, it should look something like this. I have already come back in here and measured forward and made my vertical mark at 3/4. Now you're going to need to know kind of how far up to drill these. So from the bottom of this pinch seam, you're going to make a mark 3/8 of an inch up, kind of horizontally, and that'll be the center of your hole. And that should look something like this. Then you're pretty much ready to start drilling. That process will be the same at all of your cutouts. However, in those ones where you just kind of cut out that small factory section, you're basically just going to the center of those, and then again 3/8 up. Now back up here at the front, you can kind of see and get an idea of what it looks like in one of those factory rectangle cutouts. You can see on the skid and on the slider as well, you have some slotted adjustability here. So being just a little bit off of center is not a huge deal, but try and be as close as you can. This one, slider specific, once again, is a little bit more critical because you can see this other kind of factory pinch seam running in toward the center of the vehicle here. We don't want this to interfere with our hardware when we're getting everything installed. So this one, you want to really kind of pick either forward or back of center. We went forward here about an 1/8 inch off center. That should give you enough room to get a nut in here as well as have some clearance for additional bolt length. That way you're not running into that pinch seam on the back side. With a pilot hole drilled, we'll step up to our larger 1/4 inch drill bit. So kind of a full disclosure thing here. We want to be as honest with you guys as possible so you know what you're getting into when doing this install and kind of help you out to get it done as easy as possible. So as you kind of saw us drill that first hole, you could figure it was relatively easy. We were kind of using mostly high-speed steel and cobalt coated drill bits that most of you either have or can get relatively easily from your local hardware and home good type stores. What we found as we got closer to the center of this was we were encountering some trouble when drilling with those. We were having to try and sharpen drill bits, switch drill bits quite frequently, and still not getting through this material with any form of relative ease. And we don't want you guys to have to go through that. So we did some digging, did some research, and figured out that there is a layer of what's considered ultra high strength steel in here. It is a boron steel. It, to what we can tell, is the second layer behind here. So we did some work, found something that would cut through it, and ordered up some carbide drill bits. So still 1/4 inch. So basically what we're going to do here is use a good sharp cobalt coated drill bit to get through this first layer, and then that giving us a decent pilot, we'll switch to our carbide drill bit to get through the remaining layers. A couple things we want to note if you're not familiar with carbide tooling and you haven't used any of that throughout your life. They're more brittle than the conventional drill bits that you're probably used to, so there's more potential to break one if you're not careful or if you're just unfamiliar with them. So we're going to kind of go as slow as possible or as slow as we're comfortable with, as well as use a decent drill and kind of tap and drill lubricant. And then just kind of working at this steadily. You can get through this, you can get all of these drilled. It will take a little bit of time no matter what, because you're drilling, like we said, through a hardened steel, but it doesn't have to be incredibly difficult like it kind of started out as for us. So the carbide bits that we purchased, we just got off of Amazon. We'll post that link on the product page for you guys if you want to pick up the exact same thing we're using. But again, just a carbide drill bit or even a carbide tipped drill bit will probably work just the same as long as you don't kind of break the tips off of those. The set we linked was a 5-pack. There's a good reason for that. I did wind up breaking one during the other holes that we were drilling. So ideally, get yourself at least a couple of them so you have a backup there. So with all of that being said, I've got our skid kind of wedged down so it's out of the way and we're not going to run into it as we penetrate through here. I've got our cobalt coated drill bit and some cutting lubricant, and we'll get started here. We're going to try and show you this in as much of real time as possible so that you can see what it's really going to take to get this done. So go figure, when I try to do one on camera and show it to you in real time, we had some trouble even with our cobalt coated bit here. So I've now switched it out. I've got our carbide bit, which should take care of whatever I was having problems with there. Again, we're going to use a decent amount of lubricant on that, and we'll now try and get this hole drilled. Now I will stop this one time just to point out a couple small things here. So you may have been able to kind of hear it, maybe even see it just a little bit on video there. When I get through that first layer, you'll feel the drill kind of want to grab a little bit. You're going to encounter that same thing as you get through the next layer, but it's going to want to draw the drill bit in on these spiral flutes. That's when you want to be the most careful. That's when I actually broke my bit earlier on. So take your time as you feel that happen. If it draws in, stop. Back your drill up and then take another kind of as gentle as possible run at it to try and get those last little burrs out and clean up your hole. From there, I'll just add a little more lubricant on here and we'll try and finish this one out. So you might have been able to see there, my drill bit was spinning in the chuck, so I stopped just to tighten that up, and now we'll try and finish this out. I did add a little more lubricant just for good measure. So you guys saw our little bit of struggle there. You also saw that it can be done. So you just want to account for a decent amount of time when completing this step, depending on your experience and skill level. From there, you want to finish out all of these holes and then line your skid up, even your slider, and make sure that all those holes line up well. And then after that, the last thing would just be some sort of corrosion prevention before you bolt everything in place. So even if that's just getting in here with a little touch-up brush, it doesn't have to be the same color paint necessarily if you do a nice clean job, because it'll all be covered up by hardware and then the slider and everything in here as well. You could even simply kind of spray black over each of these locations if you wanted it to kind of blend in with that black body trim. So once you've made your way through all of that, you've got your holes drilled, you've touched up any bare metal surfaces, you'll now need to find your 1/4-20 button head bolts that I have here. We do provide small washers to go with each of these, and then serrated flange nuts to go on the inside when you tighten everything up. So here on the front of the skid, if you're just installing the skid, you'll slide that nut in through this front access hole. You can use a wrench or a magnet to kind of help you out here, but it is doable just by hand if you kind of take your time. And then you can line up the bolt and get that started. From there, again, those of you just installing the skid will repeat that all the way down your skid in all of those drilled holes, and then you can work your way through and just tighten up all of your mounting hardware, kind of finishing out that skid install. Those of us installing a slider as well are going to need this removed, and then we'll grab the slider itself and the bolt that just slid down there in my skid. We'll get it up here in place and install the hardware through both of those pieces. So just like that, I've got the slider up here. We have it on a trans jack. If you're doing this on the ground, grab a floor jack. You can pretty much achieve the same thing, or just a friend to help you out for this step. I will flip it up kind of on its side here. This way you can kind of see the tabs that are going to bolt the slider to the skid underneath, and then we'll just be bolting to that same pinch seam through all the slotted holes out here on the side. If you pay attention to these tabs, they have arrows on them. Those are going to face toward the front of the vehicle. That will help you identify driver versus passenger side sliders. From there, I'm just going to slowly lift this up into place, making sure that this bolting flange winds up behind the pinch seam, and with the skid in here, it's going to wind up between the pinch seam and that skid. The way this worked out for us with our jack being angled up a little bit, we've got this first hole lined up first, so I'll start a bolt in this and then just kind of work our way back, raising it slowly and getting the remaining hardware installed. So I'm going to slide the nut in here on the back side and get it lined up with our hole, and then install another one of those 1/4-20 button head bolts. As you're working your way back down the slider and installing your remaining hardware, you may want to have either an extension with a kind of bit driver style 5/32 Allen, or like I have here, just a longer driver on a small impact to reach in here over top of the slider itself. With all of your 1/4-inch hardware in along the side, you'll then come underneath here and bolt the slider to the skid using those tabs that had the arrow cutouts in them earlier on. For this step, you're going to find the 1/2-inch button head bolts and serrated flange nuts. You'll slide the nut over the top of the skid here and then pass the bolt through both and get those threaded together. On the remaining 3 going forward, you're just going to have a rectangle cutout in the skid that allows you to slide that nut in and start it in a similar fashion. With all of your 1/2-inch hardware now in on the bottom, we can come back out here to the side and begin tightening up both our slider and our skid. So once you get to this step, you want to have the vertical bolts, those button heads underneath that were going into the nut tabs earlier on, a little bit loose so that the skid can slide just a little bit and be pulled tight to the pinch seam when tightening this 1/4-inch hardware. And then again, you'll just need your 5/32 and we can work our way down this side, tightening all of those up. For those tight, I'll now come back through and tighten up all of those 1/2-inch button heads with a 5/16 hex. Now coming back under here, we can tighten up that tie-in bracket for the subframe to the body. If you'll remember from earlier on, this is a 21 and a 14. Then you'll just work your way along the inside edge of the skid here and tighten up the button heads going into those nut strips up inside of the body or subframe assembly, if you will. These again will use a 3/16 hex. Once you have all of your mounting hardware tight, this installation is complete. You will then need to repeat this process over on the other side to get the passenger side stuff installed. As always, if you guys have any questions at all about this product or anything else we offer here at JCR Off-Road, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always email us at info@jcroffroad.com or call us at 269-353-1184.